Welcome to Chapter 2 of Computerized Accounting. And I wanted to just, before we get into the course content, talk a little bit about how assignments are going to be submitted. Last week, hopefully you did this, you registered for the SNAP site and you downloaded the SNAP software to your computer. The SNAP site is run on a Canvas platform, but it is something that is prepared by the publisher, not something that's connected to River Valley. So there was not a simple or easy way to host this course directly from that site because your grades, everything would not be connected to that automatically. So perhaps in future semesters, I will figure out how to have it be one-stop shopping. But for now, that is the site that you will use in order to upload your assignments. And so in this week's course or module, there are some videos, again, how to download the SNAP software in case you didn't do it last week, video on how to export your QuickBooks reports to Excel, because the SNAP software will require those to be in Excel format in order to grade them. And then the video on how to use SNAP in order to check and submit your case problems. So SNAP will allow you to basically, it will run a diagnostic on your QuickBooks, or excuse me, your Excel report that you exported from QuickBooks. And then it will flag any cells that contain incorrect entries. You certainly have the opportunity to go back into QuickBooks, try and figure out where you got it wrong, and correct that entry, export a new file to Excel, and then go through that process again. Or if you're satisfied or just simply can't figure out what it is and don't want to spend any more time trying and you just want to submit it, then through the SNAP, after you've run that diagnostic, you can just directly upload your completed assignment, and I can then review it, and then I will end up having to manually post your grades in the Canvas shell that you're looking at now, which is where your discussion board posts are and all of your other course content. So I know it may seem a little confusing, but and in order to try and, I guess, limit or create some opportunity for you guys to help one another, the discussion board post this week is solely going to be the thread on getting help with course stuff. So if you get stuck, you're not sure how to submit your assignment, or you're stuck downloading, first please try to go to the discussion board, and I will post the link on this site. On the general course questions, and I'll stick it there. So if you do end up with your whatever it is that you've got a problem with, and please everyone subscribe to this thread this week so that you can hopefully help one another. If I'm on the road or something and it's really difficult if I don't have my computer in front of me to offer somebody some meaningful support in the moment when they may actually need it, whereas you may be sitting in front of your computer and readily able to help somebody more quickly. So that is this week's discussion board post. So I am going to pause here, and now I will go over to the slides and get to the content. In this week, we're going to begin working with our QuickBooks files and creating transactions using vendors. And this will likely get broken up into a couple of smaller videos. I won't cover all of this in one video, and we'll just keep an eye on the time, and I'll break it up where it seems like we're at a good stopping point before it gets too long. So QuickBooks allows you to track all of your vendor transactions. And you say, well, who is a vendor? A vendor could be our supplier. It could be somebody that we buy our inventory from, our merchandise. It could also be the person who repairs our copier, the company that repairs our copier. So anyone who we do business with that we buy things from or services from is a vendor for our company. And so if you are a really organized and efficient accountant, unlike me often, you will, when you get a new vendor, you will do your vendor setup right away. What I tend to do, and you can do this, but again, not recommended, is that when you go to do your first transaction for your vendor, it will recognize, hey, we don't know who this company is. You have to set this vendor up. So now when you're trying to enter the bill or you're trying to pay the person, you have to stop, gather up all their information, create the vendor as part of that payment or whatever process, and then you can complete your transaction. That is 99% of the time how I end up doing everything. Not the best practice, however, but it can be done that way. So I strongly recommend that when you sign up your vendor, you sign the contract, all the terms go in, and then when it's time to pay that person or enter the invoice, you're not scrambling to try and find that information so that you can complete the task that you need to. So once you have your vendor established, you can enter the bills that the vendor gives you so that you have those teed up in your system and ready to pay. You can then pay those bills. You can also just write a check directly. And so we'll talk about the difference between setting something up as a payable versus just writing somebody a check because you are out of something that day and you are going to buy the case of copy paper at Staples, for example, as opposed to placing an order with Staples that you might get, well, maybe not Staples. Staples is a bad example because you'll still have to pay cash, but something that you might get billed for and be able to pay for at a later date. And so if we make this comparison to a manual system, behind the scenes, QuickBooks does all of the things that we would be doing if this were a manual system. It just it's kind of like the Wizard of Oz, and it's sort of behind the curtain, and all you see is the wizard on the front. So our vendor center is the equivalent to an accounts payable subsidiary ledger. So we would have all of our vendors listed if it was a subsidiary ledger. Our purchases journal is our enter bills window, and our cash payments journal is the write checks window. So if we were doing this in a manual system, we would have to manually post to our various accounts, our cash or our accounts payable or all of those things. QuickBooks automatically knows to some extent what pretty standard transactions ought to be posted to. So when you write a check, for example, QuickBooks knows that that's a credit to cash. It may not necessarily recognize that, what the debit side of this, but it absolutely knows that it's going to be a credit to cash. Whereas when you enter a vendor invoice in your enter bills, it will credit the accounts payable. And so you don't need to make any changes to these standard default accounts unless you have a really, really good reason and a pretty thorough understanding of accounting to know whether to make changes in the default accounts. You will quite likely have to add your own accounts because QuickBooks won't necessarily break things down. You might have an overarching accounts payable, but you might like to break that down even further if there are things like, for example, I like to know what portion of my accounts payable is for my office overhead type things versus the portion of my accounts payable that covers client related expenses. If I send something off to the sheriff for service and I get a bill from the sheriff. So I like to keep things separate just so I kind of get a sense. And it's just merely for a managerial purpose. It doesn't affect my financial statement at all. But it just gives me a sense of when I look at my payables, what what cost center within my office is fueling those. So, and we'll jump over to the live version in a second so that you can see what this looks like. But for now, we'll look at the slide, and this is the vendor center. And you will go to your vendor center off the ribbon in the top, and it will have all of your vendors displayed down the right, or excuse me, the left. You're the right. And it will have whatever vendor is highlighted here, their information will be here. And this will have all of their base data in it, what their credit terms are, what kind of vendor it is, if there's a credit limit that we have with this vendor, so that we know kind of where we're at in terms of whether or not this vendor is going to sell any more to us on credit before we make a payment because we're reaching our credit limit with them, who the appropriate contact person is within that company, and all their contact information and the payment terms. Now, if we're going to add a new vendor, we're going to select the new vendor button in the vendor field, or excuse me, off the vendor ribbon, and then we will go through and enter all of their stuff. You'll notice down here there are various tabs, and you'll want to click through all of these to make sure that you get all this information in. And this is, again, something that's really, really handy to have set up from the moment that this vendor becomes your vendor. Because when you go in and you're trying to now pay the vendor, having to find all of this information so that you can thoroughly set this up correctly the first time is kind of a pain in the neck. So it's good to just do it right at the outset and save yourself some time on the back end. Deleting a vendor is something I don't recommend doing. And the reason that I don't recommend doing it is you never know when you might wish that you had kept that information. This vendor list here can get really long. If you've been in business for years and years and years and you've been using all kinds of vendors, yeah, it'll get really long, and maybe you decide it looks a little cluttered. But you can create you can deactivate, make that vendor inactive, and you can choose from this little drop-down menu here to view only the active vendors, the inactive vendors, or all your vendors. So if it's somebody that you're not going to use, go ahead and just make that vendor inactive, but you can certainly delete it. And basically you would do that by clicking the edit and then the delete vendor key from this menu. To edit a vendor, you go to your vendor center, open the individual vendor's file, and then you just click edit to edit the information. So these little pencil things here also will allow you to do that. And so why don't we, and this is also how you make the vendor inactive down here, this little box in the corner. So I'm going to pause here. Actually, I'm going to stop this video here. We'll pick up the next video with the live version at the vendor center, and then you can see what these things look like for real.